let's have a look at the state of play of where we are now with Brexit. Do you think that Brexit has actually been achieved, fulfilled?
Yes, to a large extent. There are one or two bits that haven't been fulfilled, and they've got to be fulfilled, and that is most particularly, of course, the issue of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which still ties Northern Ireland to EU regulations in goods, and as a consequence has an impact upon trade within the rest of the UK. But apart from that, yes, we have achieved a huge amount. We are free of the European Court of Justice so far as the mainland UK is concerned. We're in a position to strike our own free trade agreements around the world, and we're doing that very successfully with Australia and New Zealand, hopefully with India before long. So yes, we're in a much better position than we were. And certainly if you rewind 7 years, I think a lot of people would have been delighted to see us get to the position that we are now.
What needs to happen going forward to realise the full potential of Brexit?
Well, legally, we have to be rid of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And in fact, the Centre for Brexit Policy, of which I'm a chairman, in fact, has put forward a proposal for mutual enforcement, which should be a good legal solution to the difficulty of Northern Ireland. But beyond that, I think it's a question of a change in the mindset. People have got to get used to the idea that we're now a free, independent country and we can make our own way in the world. And this most particularly has got to be taken on board in Whitehall. You have to remember that there are no officials working for the government now who can remember a time when we were not part of the European Union. And there's a kind of phantom limb syndrome going on. European Union has been amputated and been got rid of, but they just feel as if it's still there somehow. And it's that change in mindset, I think, that will do most of all to help us start to realise the real benefits of Brexit.
Do you think there have been any negative outcomes from the Leave result?
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, there has been a deterioration in our relations with the European Union. That's got to be faced. On the other hand, it was always entirely foreseeable that if we decided to leave the European Union, there would be a certain amount of resentment on the part of the Europeans. A lot of the smallest member states are really quite cross with us because we were always regarded as the counterbalance to Germany within the Council. And I remember once having a meeting in Vienna when a lady from Lithuania came up to me and actually said to me, "Please don't go." This was before the referendum. "Please don't go. Don't leave us to the Germans." So there was always that feeling that Britain was a big player within the European Union, acting as that counterbalance against Germany, and that's gone. And a lot of the smaller member states do regret our passing.
What would you like to see the government do now regarding Brexit to really start delivering on the results that everybody who voted Leave really want to see take place?
Well, as I said, we do need to see them gripping the issue of the Northern Ireland Protocol. For so long as that's there, and it is still there because the Windsor Framework is essentially a wrapper for the Northern Ireland Protocol. So long as it's still there, we're going to be held back because we're going to be subject effectively to EU regulations in goods. So that's something that has got to be gripped. I think more widely, again, we need to see a message of optimism from the government. We need to see them communicating what we've achieved already in terms of the free trade deals and so on. We need a much more upbeat communication from the government than we've been having so far. And sadly, there are still some members of the government who've regarded Brexit as something to be managed and a bad job to be made the best of. That's not the way it is. They should recognise that the people of this country voted for Brexit because they wanted something better, and they've got to make sure that people understand that already they have got something better.
What do you think the risk is of us moving back towards the regulatory lockhold of Brussels, or essentially returning to the EU covertly?
Oh, I think that there's a real danger of that. I think most particularly there's a danger if the Labour Party win the next general election. There's no doubt that Keir Starmer is a dyed-in-the-wool Remainer. He wanted to have a second referendum, you recall. So he would like to get us, again, back within the orbit of Brussels. David Lammy has made a speech very recently in which he said very much the same thing. So I think that that is a real danger, and I think that when people come to the next general election, They've got to start thinking about what a vote for the Labour Party really means. It means rolling back the clock and going back to something very, very close to EU membership. And that's not what I believe most people in this country want.
If that were to happen, what would be the biggest risks facing the United Kingdom if we were back in the fold?
Well, I mean, if we were to make an application to rejoin the European Union, for example, we'd have to sign up to the single currency, which is an inherently weak and unstable currency because it's not backed by sovereign wealth. So that's one thing that people should think very carefully about. We would be losing our own currency. Furthermore, I think there's no doubt that if we were to rejoin the European Union, the EU would make sure that there wasn't another Article 50 process whereby we could get out. In other words, this time it really would be the Hotel California. We might want to leave, but we would have to stay.
Economically speaking, what do you see the future of the European Union looking like?
I think it's deteriorating. There's no doubt that the centre of gravity of world trade and world commerce and world industry is moving towards the Far East. And the European Union is going to become a much less significant world economic power, particularly because, of course, it's a socialist model. And that will hold it back in competition with other economies around the world.
What do you think are the great advantages that's ahead of Britain in the coming decades as an independent nation?
Well, we've got access to free trade agreements around the world. The European Union is looking increasingly sclerotic. It's top-heavy in terms of regulation, it's becoming increasingly uncompetitive and is accounting for a much smaller proportion of world trade. Whereas, of course, the UK now is becoming a member of the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a combination of some of the most dynamic economies in the world. And that really reflects the centre of gravity for world trade and commerce. And we are actually part of that. And the European Union isn't. And that's something, again, we should be looking forward to.
Why do you think it became such a divisive debate? Why do you think there is a cohort of people who passionately believe that the UK is better off being essentially governed by somebody else?
That was something that I could never quite understand. I mean, it is, whichever way you look at it, is an abnormal state of affairs. Most citizens of a country want that country to be independent. There was really almost a cultish approach to the European Union. It was an article of faith that you wanted to be governed by somebody else. There were some people who, for example, regarded it as a good counterbalance to our imperial past, for which they had huge feelings of guilt. I never understood that either. Lots of countries have decolonized without being ruled by somewhere else. In fact, it's a very strange state of affairs where you atone for your guilt over empire by becoming part of another empire. That's the last thing that you need to do. There are a whole host of reasons, none of which I could really quite understand.
Okay, let's talk about common defence policy. I mean, we were told that there was no way that the EU were planning to forge its own army, and yet the EU's moving into the space of foreign affairs is, for those who observe it, quite clear. What are your thoughts on things such as the development of PESCO and the part that the UK should play?
I think we have to recognise that the guarantor of peace in Europe since the last war has been NATO. NATO is hugely important to this country and in fact to every European state, including European states outside the European Union. And the problem that we've got is that certain EU member states are setting up PESCO as a rival to NATO. They say that they're not. They say that it's an adjunct to NATO, but that is not the case. They do want to see a European defence force, a European army. They want to see European forces engaged in expeditions overseas and so on. And I think that that's deeply worrying. The United Kingdom has recently indicated that it wants to join one element of PESCO. There are over 60 elements of PESCO, but the one that we want to join is the military mobility element, which is ostensibly to put in place arrangements for the fast movement of troops and equipment across the continent of Europe. in itself fairly innocuous. In fact, innocuous to the extent that the United States, Canada and Norway, none of which are EU member states, have actually signed up to it. But you always get the feeling that this is the thin end of the wedge, and that the European Union will then be suggesting that we join another element and another element. And do bear in mind, it's a one-way process. PESCO stands for Permanent Structured Cooperation. In other words, once we're part of that cooperation, we're there for good. So we have to be extremely careful of this. It may well be that the military mobility element in itself is innocuous, but I think that we should be very careful about surrendering our sovereignty in terms of our defence policy to another supranational entity, which effectively is controlled by Brussels.
Do you believe that when people went to the ballot box on the 23rd of June, that they knew what they were voting for and that honest campaigns had been fought?
They knew that they were voting to get Britain out of the European Union. It was a very straightforward binary choice. Should Britain remain a member of the European Union or should it leave? And they made their decision. So I have no doubt at all that they knew exactly what they were voting for. I was very active in that campaign for several months before the vote. In fact, every week I'd set up my stall in the streets of Colwyn Bay and other North Wales towns and talk to people about it. And there was a strong feeling, which may be translated as, it's all about sovereignty, it's all about running our own affairs. And we don't want to have our affairs run anymore by someone from another country. We want to run our own affairs, thank you very much. So it was a very simple choice. And then, of course, after the vote, we had all these debates about what sort of Brexit did we want. Well, it was quite straightforward. We wanted a Brexit which took us out of the European Union. And anything that didn't do that didn't actually cut the mustard. And it's really quite extraordinary to see the extent to which pro-Europeans have maintained this battle, even though the British people told them quite clearly that they wanted to leave. And these are people who in the next breath would probably tell you that of course they're Democrats, but they find it hard to accept democracy.
Finally, what would be your message to fellow parliamentarians, to businesses, to voters regarding Brexit? I mean, would you say hold your nerve? Would you say better times are coming? Can you give guarantees that Brexit is going to deliver on the promises made to people?
Well, I think Brexit has to a large extent already delivered. We have recovered our sovereignty with the caveat about Northern Ireland, and we're moving on to make our own way in the world. And what I would say to people is, when they do get into the ballot box, just consider what the future would be if you were to elect a government that was run by people who really, deep in their heart of hearts, despite what they say, want us to rejoin the European Union. It's as simple as that. You simply can't take a gamble with it. What we've achieved over the last 7 years has been hard fought and hard won. And we now have to make sure that we get the benefits of that and don't slide back into the orbit of Brussels.